Made in Latin America.
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 Welcome to Made in Latin America, a new podcast brought to you by the Santo Domingo Centre of Excellence for Latin American Research at the British Museum. In this podcast, you'll be listening to insights and interpretations about iconic collections at the British Museum, as well as examples from the more than 60,000 items, of which many have never been on display. Join us in this series that will deepen and challenge what you know about Latin America.
This season explores the Untitled Codex, one of the few surviving pre-Hispanic pictorial manuscripts made more than 500 years ago in the Mixtec region in Mexico. In which language is it written? Why is its blue color so unique? What stories does it tell? The podcast will be hosted by two curators from the Latin America Center, Laura Osorio Sonax and Maria Mercedes Martinez Milanchi. Indigenous researchers, communities, and artists working with this codex will join us throughout the season.
Hi, everybody. This is Mercedes and Laura from the Santo Domingo Center of Excellence for Latin American Research at the British Museum, and welcome to the Made in Latin America podcast. In this episode, we'll delve deeper into the pictorial language in which the codex is written. This means that there's no alphabetic writing. Instead, the manuscript is made up of pictographs or pictures that have different meanings. In this third episode, we'll talk about how Indigenous scholars today are deciphering the codex with their contemporary Indigenous languages. Just to remind you how it's going to work, me and Laura are going to have a conversation, and then we'll have some comments from different specialists, and throughout the episode, you'll be listening to a creative retelling of the Untitled Codex, read by Miguel Villegas Ventura.
Young love, true hearts, first kiss. Whatever these words mean to you, see it now in despair. Lord 8 dear jug of claw, smiling wider than the smiles with anyone else. Lady 6 monkey, a princess no less, and happy smiling back. Let's say they walk, they don't. This journey is a static one, through those great depths of space within us rather than without. In reality then, they sit with the priest, a wise man. His eyes closed, grizzled, hard. It is less romantic picture, so let us say instead they walk, just a pair, arm in arm. Let us say she picks a flower from beside their path, twirls it quick between nervous fidget fingers. Let us say he lifts her in his arms, playing, nervous too. They are laughing, screaming, evading, grinning as they have done throughout their youth. They both want to delay, to dawdle here among the flowers and embrace. Both will much rather linger longer, tarry for forever as young hearts, true loves, first kisses. But instead, both continue, both walk on, spiritual step after step, toward the dark place.
In this episode, we're going to talk about the Mixtec language. So, Laura, what language is depicted pictographically in the codex?
Well, it's the Tunsavi, it's the language of the Mixtec people. And I think where the Untitled Codex is different from perhaps a European book is that it doesn't denote syllables and sounds in the same way as the Latin alphabet, for example. So they look more like ideas and sort of happenings that are pictured pictographically. But that doesn't mean to say that they don't relate strongly to the way that the language itself was spoken, that it couldn't be read. In fact, it clearly was read, and it clearly continues to be read by Mixtec people now.
And so if it's written pictographically and all we see are depictions of either places or people or things, like how do we know it's related to the language?
So there are lots of different symbols or pictures inside the codex that I think are quite self-evident. I think they're self-evident to people who aren't necessarily from the Mixtec culture. So, for example, Lord 8 Deer's name. It has a deer's head, which is pretty recognisable, and then it has 8 little dots. So you can read that even if you don't know a lot about the culture. There are lots of depictions of Lord 8 Jaguar deer, for example, in battle regalia, which even if you don't know much about Mixtec battle dress. You can read the spears, the shields. These things are sort of obvious. And then, of course, there are nuances in the narrative that are much more difficult to decipher. And I think that's where it becomes clear to me what a deep relationship there is between the contents of the codex and the way that people express themselves nowadays, and must have done at the time. And the way that is done is through much more complex compounds of ideas.
So before we dive into the different language devices and metaphorical tropes that are used in the codex and in spoken Mixtec today, can we talk a bit more about how the codex was read, and if it was read aloud, if it was read communally, if it was read by an individual in the community that was the codex reader? Yes,
so that's a question that I think a lot of pictorial manuscript scholars have been mulling over for a long time. And there's no clear knowledge of how reading took place in the 12th century when the Untitled Chapter Codex is set. But they have looked at different sources, both some colonial sources, some indigenous sources from the colonial period, from lots of other pictorial manuscripts to look at the representations of people reading, or looking at representations of people speaking out loud and addressing, etc. And the consensus, as far as I know, is that it was probably something which was esoteric. I don't think it was necessarily a public demonstration of and reinforcement of history or necessarily ritual. It would have been a highly, let's say, weighty exercise. So almost akin to a religious experience. I don't mean to say a religious experience in a sense of a trance or spirituality necessarily, but I mean in the sense of how serious the engagement with the contents of the literature was.
Interesting. And when we think about this codex, we think about Mixtec language, but that's sort of a misnomer, right? There's not one Mixtec language. There's several variants. Some places I read more than 50 variants of Mixtec language. And when people talk between each other, for example, if the UK English versus the US English, we understand each other, I would say almost perfectly. But in terms of Mixtec, you'd understand between 15 and 20%, which isn't very much.
Yes. So again, I'm guessing I'm not a Mixtec speaker, but I think that's in part because of the fact that the language is tonal. So I learned a little bit of Mixtec when I was at university, and the way that I learned it, there was a middle tone and then there was a higher and a lower tone. And what it means is that when you're trying to denote meaning, you need to inflect the tone of the previous syllable in comparison with your new syllable in the next word, in order to show that something is either lower or higher. And so I think that that's perhaps something that causes a little bit of variability in the way that it is sort of transmitted in certain regions. It's also a very vast region. There haven't been enormous and long-standing efforts to standardize the Mixtec language. And so naturally it's kind of evolved differently in different places.
Yeah, and what they call classic Mixtec is taken from a Dominican codex, right? So it's an odd way to designate, I guess, the standard of a language.
I suppose these are the earliest attempts to codify the language, and there have been more recent ones. But there is still disagreement between the Mixtec scholars that I know on that standardization.
The Temple of Death, their destination. They stride in, metaphorically, still smiling, to see what gods and spirits make of their match. The son of a priest, Lord 8 Deer, and highborn princess, Lady 6 Monkey. Will any ancestors dare give divine vindication and allow them to wed? Standing before them, tall and powerful and dreadful, Lady Ninegrass, the spiritual guardian of the Temple of Death. She stares with bloodshot eyes that flay the flesh, and her skeletal bone jaw jutters with the click-clack spine-straining rattle. They do not quiver, the princess or her love. They come prepared with offerings. The princess brings jewels and ritual robes to lay at the dead spirit's feet. Lord 8 Deer Juggle Claw is not so subtle. He brings a simple heart, wrapped in a sheet now stained with blood. He gently unwraps, holds it out in his hands, and lazy but the jewel and robes. A fist of red as rich as any ruby. Will the spirit bless their union? Will the spirits bless their union? The lovers hold their breath.
And so thinking about how the story of Lord Eight-Eared Jaguar Claw is told and thinking about the complexities of the Mixtec language, like how do you create sentences with pictographs? Like how do you denote a story and one that has such like interesting ups and downs and twists and drama? That's
it, isn't it? I think we would be inclined to think with something that's written in pictures and symbols that the story is very simplistic in the way that we understand iconography in Western artwork. One of the ways that that's done in the Untitled Codex, because certainly, as you say, this is a story with pivot points, it's a story with high drama, it's a story with murder, with love, lust for power, tragedy. And the way that that's done is through what are called these Fracismos, which are the coupling of two words or ideas, concepts together. And what they denote is a sort of third word or a third concept that is ultimately a little bit more complex in meaning and somewhat subjective. So there are lots of examples. There are lots of examples of those things. Some of them are more simplistic than others, but all of them, as they are described in image, are, I think, quite poetic. And they're still used in the Mixtec language, and they're highly evocative.
What are some examples of the Fracismos that you can see in the codex and in other pictographic manuscripts done by the Mixtec?
Sure. As I said, there are some Fracismos that are very straightforward. So one of the more straightforward ones, I think, is actually the Fracismo for writing. Commonly, codices were written in red and black. The red, as I said, creates the frets to read the boustrophodon, and the outlines are black. So they're sort of the core colours of the codex. Okay, so if you say red and black and codices are written in red and black, then you would imagine that third meaning is codex. But it's not just codex, it's writing. It evokes something concrete often that relates to the two different concepts that you've got, but it also goes beyond that concrete thing to evoke a much bigger concept.
So the concept of the Fracismos isn't unique to the Mixtec, right? This is sort of quite common across different Mesoamerican cultures.
That's right. It's the Fracismos are used in indigenous languages. In central Mexico, they're used in Mayan languages. What's important to note as well is that not only is the sort of construction, the sort of metaphorical trope of using these two concepts that to lead to a bigger subjective whole, something which happens in other indigenous regions and languages, it's also the exact same couplings of things that are used. Not in every case, but in many cases, it's the same metaphorical tropes that are used.
And so how are these languages written today? Like, have all of them just adopted the Latin alphabet just for simplicity and mutual understanding?
Yeah, I mean, partly, as we've been talking about, some of the knowledge about how to codify those languages in pre-Columbian Mesoamerican script have been effectively lost. But yes, also through the process of colonialism, they have been transferred now to the Latin alphabet, and that's how people, when they do learn them.
Ako cueva, chico antiquindo na taso onyaro, shindominicano dosi ando ichi, naka in ubitumisindo. Hello, my name is Miguel Villegas Ventura, also known as Una Isu. And today I'll be talking about the importance of speaking your native language. I currently reside here in Fresno, California, United States. Like many families, we were forced to migrate due to economic reasons, displacement, and looking for a better life. When I arrived here in the United States, I only spoke my native language, which is Mixteco, Tu'un Sabi. It is here where I learned how to speak Spanish, and eventually I also learned English. When I was young, I didn't realize that speaking a native language was something that was not very common. Everybody spoke Spanish or either English, but nobody spoke a native language. So I felt a little bit out of place, but tried to fit in with other kids. Growing up, I also faced discrimination, not only for being somebody that migrated here to the United States, but also for being indigenous or coming from a family that are farm workers. The biggest discrimination came from the same people of my country of origin, Mexico. They will look at us differently, or they would treat us differently. They will call us names, and obviously our color of skin was darker. This made me try to hide who I was. Even the state where I was from, Oaxaca, wasn't very well respected. For whatever reason, we were always being discriminated. And I wanted to fit in. I wanted to learn English. So for this reason, I wanted to stop speaking my native language. My native language was always spoken at home with my mother and my siblings. But, in the streets or at school or other spaces, it was mostly English. It is until I got older that I realized that discrimination and classism existed way before, all the way back during colonization. At least in Mexico, that discrimination, that separation from being native and being the common working people in the city. Back in Mexico, we do have a history of teachers forcing our parents and grandparents to learn Spanish, and they will prohibit for them to speak their native language. With that mentality that it was a barrier to learn Spanish because we spoke our native language. So that's why many parents also didn't teach their children the native language, because they didn't want them to suffer or go through the same experience they went through. Once I understood the history of my people, the oppression that we faced, I started to realize that I shouldn't stop speaking my native language. My language is the connection with my family, with my community, and with my ancestors. So I started to value it more. I started to speak it more, and I started to introduce myself in my native language in all the spaces where I will be. Our roots can be traced back for thousands of years, and you could find that in the codices, how long we've been around in this continent. Today, what I do is I incorporate my native language in my rap music that I do, a trilingual rap project that I have. I also teach the language. I give workshops. And with this, my goal is to show other people that it's possible to conserve your native language and still learn other languages, such as Spanish or English. You don't have to forget about your native language to learn other languages. So that's my message to the youth, to the people, that it's possible to be multilingual. And we shouldn't forget about our language, because that's a connection to the way we view the world, our cosmic vision, our culture, our knowledge, all those things that our parents have taught us, our grandparents have taught us, and our ancestors have taught us.
Lady Nine Grass, the spirit of the temple of death, shudders, stares, and then, with great solemnity, shakes her deathly head. The lovers gasp. She shakes again. The bone-made jaw opens. A voice like howling gales commands. The princess will not marry this low-born priest's son. She must marry to an ancient house, the noble Lord 11 Wind. The old man is powerful. His allegiance brings prestige, security. Princess, you must do this for your people. This is the will of Lady Nine Grass. And if our ears were tuned enough, we might hear heartstrings break. There is no reply. There can be no reply to the will of the divine. The world around the couple vibrates with deep bass notes, as if thousand sea snail trumpets sound at once, to shunt and jar the once smooth air in the sharp and brittle shapes. But you, Jawa Claw, are destined elsewhere. No little life for you. You will be a great warrior. Your path is hard, but I have gifts for you of power. An owl arrow, a skull shield, weapons of mystic strength, a golden fish, and a conch shell. The ocean calls for you, a blue stone bowl for the blood of your offerings, and the last, She says this with a smile. A decorated dish for offerings of hearts. With this, the spirits fade. The world returns. The journey over, and all smiles gone. Were we to make a film in this moment, we might expect a close-up as a single tear as it rolls down our young man's face. No tear. Instead, within those dried eyes, rage. A flame takes light such that a tear from those eyes will sizzle in an instant. It will burn villages and bake flesh, that flame. And that fire that stings the lids of Jaguar Claw this day turns away from Lady Six Monkey, his once young heart, true love, first kiss, who must now wed another. He cannot speak. He clasps and unclasps his fist, accepts the gifts the temple has bestowed, and walks unceasingly, unswervingly away. The young woman is left with the flame of her own and a different path now to tread.
In our next episode, we're going to discuss the indigenous community behind the stories told by the Codex, as well as how the object was made. The Mixtec people, or New Savi, which means the people of the rain, mainly live in Mexico today, although many have emigrated to the United States and Europe as well. Join us for this next episode to learn more about contemporary indigenous communities and their living legacies. Thanks, and until next time.
The Epic of Lord A. Deer was read aloud by Miguel Villegas Ventura. This creative reinterpretation, scripted by Jack Monahan, is based on the Toninteye and other Mixtec codices that mention Lord A. Deer's story. We are particularly indebted to the book Encounter with the Plumed Serpent, Drama and Power in the Heart of Mesoamerica by Martin Jensen and Gavina Aurora Perez Jimenez, and the play Recreation of the History Told in the Mixtec Codices by the community theater Yo New Savi, directed by Maria Ofelia Porras Lescas.
This podcast season is made possible by the generosity of Alejandro and Charlotte Santo Domingo and Mrs. Julio Mario Santo Domingo with Andres and Lauren Santo Domingo. If you want to know more about the Santo Domingo Center, please visit SDCellar website, sdcellarbritishmuseum.org. This podcast was recorded, engineered, and edited by Prong Productions. For more information on Prong, please visit prongproductions.com. That's PRONK productions.com.